Today we will be talking about amphibians. And the word amphibian actually means two lives because they spend about half their life in the water and half of their life on land. Um, so amphibians are vertebrates that live on water when they are larvae and adults. They live on land. They breathe through gills as young, but have fully developed lungs as adults. They also have this moist skin that contains mucus glands that protect it and allow it to absorb oxygen through its skin. And they generally lack scales and claws. There are some exceptions, but most lack scales and claws. So, amphibians are the first group that we are discussing that live on land for a majority of their life. They represent a huge step of evolution in terms of all the animals we've talked about so far in the year. Um, because the movement onto land was a very, very big transition for life. Here are some of the challenges. Oxygen is 20 times more abundant in the air than it is in water. And having more oxygen in the air isn't necessarily good. Um, Oxygen can oxidize things, and oxidize things means potentially burn it, right? So, too much oxygen can destroy tissues. So, being able to adapt to the large amounts of oxygen in the air was a big challenge. The air is also 1,000 times less dense than water, so it provides less buoyancy and less support for the limbs and skeletal systems, which means those limbs and skeletal systems need to support more weight on land than they do in the water. And then also, air temperature fluctuates more rapidly than in water. Think about Pleasanton. It's a great example. It can go from being very, very cold in the morning in the 50s to being 100 degrees in the afternoon. Um, Air temperature fluctuates extreme compared to water temperatures. But there's also a variety of terrestrial habitats, which allows a greater opportunity for adaptation over large areas of land. So here are some of the major differences between fish and amphibians, and let's just take the lungfish, which is a lobefin fish, and it's the sister group of tetrapods. So they have a stronger backbone, amphibians do, muscles to elevate the head. Think about it, you don't have to raise your head when you're in water, you can just look straight ahead. But on land, you have to look above and over things. Stronger hip and shoulder girdles. Those hip and shoulder girdles can support the limbs to allow the limbs to support against gravity. A more protective rib cage and sternum to protect lungs. A modified ear structure to detect airborne sounds. And eggs that can't dry out on land. The first amphibians show up about 360 million years ago in the fossil record. Here are a couple artist recreation based off of the fossil record that show some of the missing link organisms from water to land. And we can see the progression of the limbs here from ones that have some of these precursors, but these bones that aren't necessarily great for walking, to a little bit more advanced walking limbs. Some features are systems that we need to discuss, so let's just work our way through them. Respiration in amphibians works generally where the larval amphibians use their skin and gills, and adult amphibians use their skin and lungs. Lungs have a high blood supply and folds to increase surface area, so oxygen can be absorbed throughout any of these folds. As oxygen diffuses into the blood vessels that surround the lungs. Amphibians feed on plants when they are young. They are herbivores and usually feed on insects as adults, so they are carnivores. The digestive system looks a little bit like yours, where the food breaks down in the stomach. It passes to the small intestine, which you see right here, where most of the absorption happens. And then you have things like the liver, the pancreas, the gallbladder, which all aid in digestion. The liver makes bile, which helps to break down fats. The pancreas makes enzymes to help break down the food in the small intestine. And the gallbladder holds the extra bile that was made from the liver. And then the large intestine is what absorbs extra water from the body, but also the large intestine leads to this final hole in the body called the cloaca. The cloaca is where digestive waste, urine, and even reproductive products like egg and sperm leave the body. It's a one-stop shop, all-purpose hole in the amphibians called a cloaca. Um, the skin of amphibians is pretty unique. If you've ever done a frog dissection in like middle school, you would have felt how thin it feels. But within that thin layer of skin, there's a couple different glands that protect the amphibian. So the two main types we're going to talk about are a mucus gland and a serous gland. The mucus gland secretes a mucus-like substance that waterproofs the skin, and then the serous gland produces a white, watery poison to protect the frog. And you have some frogs that are highly, highly toxic, and they have these highly toxic skin um, poisons. And usually those frogs are the more highly colored versions and varieties that you see in nature. Um, Generally, bright colors means super poisonous. Don't eat me. One last thing on their skin is frogs are ectotherms, which means that they cannot produce their own heat. So their body temperature depends on the environment that surrounds them. Circulatory system for frogs. They have a three-chambered heart that forms a double loop in the body. So there is a left and right atrium and one single ventricle. And so this is how it works. We have blood coming from the body that's deoxygenated that comes into one of the atriums, the right atrium here. And then it goes into the ventricle. And at the same time, blood returning from the lungs pulls in the left atrium and then gets pumped into the same ventricle. And they mix together and then get pumped to the rest of the body um, through the ventricle, right? So left and right atrium bring deoxygenated and oxygenated blood. Um, and then they meet in the ventricle, and then the ventricle pumps blood throughout the rest of the body. And so what's actually happening here is you're pumping blood that isn't necessarily as rich as the purely oxygenated blood. It gets mixed, it's less oxygenated than the blood in your body. But that works for the amphibian because their skin also does respiration. It's so thin that oxygen can diffuse through the skin. And so they can make up for not having fully oxygenated blood by having skin that allows them to respire as well. And we can just see here comparing the different hearts that we'll see. We just saw the fish heart, which is a single loop circulation, two chambers, pumps it to the gills brings it to the rest of the body, and then it returns. In amphibians and most reptiles, they have this three-chambered heart where there's this mixing of the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. And it's a two-loop system here. But when we eventually get to the mammals, we'll see it's a two-loop system as well. There's double circulation, but it's completely separated because the body has a greater need for oxygenated blood. The excretory system of amphibians, they use kidneys, filters out waste from the blood, creates urine, travels through the ureters to the cloaca, where it can be stored in a little bladder. Reproduction. In most species of amphibians, the female lays eggs in the water, and the male fertilizes it externally, so most are oviparous. After fertilization, the frog eggs are encased in a sticky, transparent jelly that basically allows it to stay moist without drying out on land, and it's placed in a safe location. There is a vocab word that you're going to need to know called amphilexis, which is a mating technique used by the male frogs, where the male frog basically suctions onto the female frog to ensure that he fertilizes the eggs himself. This is what it looks like. Male frogs are generally smaller than female frogs. So the male frog is on the back here of the female. Basically looks like a hug on the female, where he locks himself in this position until the eggs are fertilized. Um, it can be hours, it can be days, and in one species of toad, it actually can last up to 4 months. And this process, again, is to ensure that this male is the one that fertilizes the female. Oftentimes, though, you might have situations like this where multiple males are trying to attach onto the female, so they create this kind of like chain of frogs. Frog metamorphosis, we all know about how frog eggs turn into these little tadpoles, and they stay as tadpoles for usually somewhere between a couple days to a few weeks. And as they go through the progression of life, they start to gain legs, lose their tail, and become young and adult frogs. Their response system, amphibians have relatively good eyes that are protected and kept moist by a nictitating membrane. If you've ever seen a frog blink, there's like a clear layer that passes over the frog's eye. It's not a true eyelid, but it's a membrane that covers it. Amphibians also have a tympanic membrane, which is basically like an external eardrum located on each side of their head. And most amphibians also still have a lateral line system, a remnant of their fish ancestors, that can detect movements in the water. So the three orders of amphibians that you need to know about that are alive today are basically Order Chordata, which are the salamanders and newts, Order Anura, which are the frogs and toads, and then Order Apata, which are the caecilians, which kind of look like a cross between a snake and a earthworm. So we're going to go through each one of those. Order Chordata is the salamanders, and that includes generally newts and salamanders. The difference between a newt and a salamander is a newt are generally salamanders that live in dry areas with more dry and warty skin. Both animals here have long bodies and a tail. They have 4 legs at a right angle to their body. They respire through skin and lungs. Both the adults and the larvae of salamanders are carnivores. The adults usually live in the moist woods where they tunnel under rocks or rotting logs, and they stay moist in that area. And salamanders are actually an example of internal fertilization, where the female recovers a spermatophore deposited on a leaf or a stick and brings it into her cloaca and does internal fertilization that way. Here is a salamander. And I'm going to show you a couple other examples. Spotted salamander. Some of you have probably seen the California newt. The California newt actually migrates through Pleasanton at a certain time of the year. So it migrates and makes its way from Southern California range up through the Pleasanton area all the way up to Oregon, where it mates and then comes back down. These guys are actually highly, highly poisonous if eaten. So if you do ever see one of these guys and handle it, which they are safe to handle, just make sure you wash your hands afterwards and don't have a plan to eat them. This is known as a giant Japanese salamander. It is one of the largest amphibians in the world. And when I make that little Google doc that has all the videos, I have a couple of videos on the giant salamander. So the red-spotted newt actually has a pretty interesting life cycle. It's a little bit different than all other amphibians, so I wanted to show you for a second. So here are the eggs. They're aquatic. They stay underwater. They give rise to a gilled larvae. The gilled larvae turns into this thing called a red eft. which actually stays on land for somewhere between 1 and 3 years, but then they transition into a more secondary aquatic phase as an adult, where they live out the rest of their life on land. And the difference between the adult and the larvae is the presence of the gills. And so the adults have lungs where they go up and breathe every once in a while. Um, some salamanders can display this trait called pediomorphosis. And pediomorphosis is the retention of juvenile features as an adult. Common example is the retention of these gills that are external as an adult. And so there are two main species of salamanders that display this pediomorphosis, and that's this common mud puppy here, usually found in North America, southern states, and the axolotl. The axolotl lives in Mexico, but also can make its way up into Texas. And both of these salamanders resemble basically large juveniles that keep the gills as adults. This is the Mexican axolotl. I think it is adorable, and it is one of my favorite animals worldwide. This is the adult form. It doesn't move a lot. It also has a really cool mechanism that is studied worldwide. It is able to replace any limb that is cut off in full. You can cut off a finger, a hand, or the full arm, and it will grow back in full over time. So axolotls are studied worldwide for their ability to regenerate. So that was all of our salamanders and newts. Let's move on to our frogs and toads, which is order Anura. So order Anura has tailed larval stages and a tailless jumping adult stage. Frogs and toads, one of their main traits that is unique to them is the ability to jump. If you've ever held a frog or manipulated a frog, their main defense is to jump away from things. Toads have thicker skin and are covered by more warty projections than frogs. The poison that they secrete is really only harmful if you swallow it or it gets in your eyes. So if you handle a frog, a toad, or anything that secretes these poisons, make sure you wash your hands, just like we talked about with the California newt. They must live near a water source because their reproduction requires water. And the skin is water permeable, which means they need to stay moist. And so the form that can go to extreme levels. You can have frogs that live in the mud. You can have frogs that live in areas where it only gets rain 3 or 4 times a year, where we might consider desert, but they can dig themselves little chambers underneath water or underneath the land to where they stay in like a more moist chamber underneath the water or underneath the land and come out when it rains. There are 44 families of frogs and toads. The common larger frogs found in North America look like this. If you've seen or have a pet tree frog, they look like this. And then we have the toad family. Here's the exception to not being clawed. This is known as the African clawed frog. It's one of the only amphibians in the world to have claws. Here is the frog skeleton, and I hope that you notice some of the basic similarities between your skeleton and the frog skeleton, whether it's the large scapula here, which is part of the shoulder girdle, the digits on the feet. There's 5 digits here compared to 4 in the hand. Here's the hip bones. You could also see here's a femur. Your body has a femur. Instead of having 2 bones for the tibia and fibia, they have one fused bone called the tibofibula. Similar thing happens in the forearm where there's a humerus, but there's no separation of radius and ulna. There's a radial ulna. They still have the carpals, which are the wrist bones, and the metacarpals, which are the bones that make up, in your hand, kind of the lower part here. In a frog's hand, it makes up kind of the elongated fingers, and then the phalanges, which are like your fingers. So there's no diaphragm in a frog, and the diaphragm is the muscle that helps you breathe naturally. It helps your lungs work, and so instead, they have to use pressure within certain cavities to force air down their mouth, um, through the nostrils, down the mouth, and into the lungs. So imagine having to breathe by basically swallowing air continuously. Um, and so there's this force of air into and out of the body by frogs. Here's a pretty cool example I wanted to show you. It's known as a frost-tolerant frog. So this frog can survive temperatures in the negative and still come out on the other side alive. So it can prepare its body for freezing temperatures by accumulating glucose and glycerin in its body fluids and moving water out of its cells into the surrounding area around it. There's going to be an article and a video you watch on this type of frog. I find it pretty interesting. So we already talked a little bit about frog reproduction, so I'm not going to go over the life cycle again, but I did want to talk about the protection of the eggs. So there's a few different forms that the eggs can be protected. Some frogs can make like this egg sac that they can put in a chamber somewhere underneath water. Some frogs have more extreme examples where they keep the eggs on their own body, where they make a protective casing on their back, and the little baby frogs can crawl out, whether it's a tadpole or a full-grown frog like we see here in this bee example. And then final order we have here to talk about is order Apata, which are known as the caecilians. The caecilians, I think, again, they look like a cross between an earthworm and a snake. You can see a couple more examples here. The difference in size they can take, adult and young. You can see, though, the eyes and the mouth definitely makes them different than an earthworm. They are legless animals. They live either in water or in more moist soils. Most species are blind. They feed on small invertebrates such as termites and insects. They are found in South America, Africa, and India, and they can grow up to 1.5 meters in length as full-grown adults. They have a vertebrate skull, long ribs, just like most other amphibians. There's no scale, and the eyes, even though we see the little slits here, most have become remnants. So they're not used anymore. They have internal fertilization, where some of them even have copulatory organs. Most are oviparous, though you see some viviparous and live birth on young. And then the larvae sometimes are aquatic, sometimes dwell on land. Sometimes there's a metamorphosis, or sometimes they're even born as the adults. And that's the end of our amphibian notes here. Thank you for watching.